job. And while we're talking of my favourite ongoing political mess, also known as the mining resources rent tax, here to comment on the latest shenanigans, Shadow Assisted Treasurer, West Australian Senator Matthias Cormann, who's talking to me from Canberra. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, Janine, welcome back.
Well, the last time we spoke, it's like Groundhog Day on this tax, really, isn't it? Last time we spoke, the West Australian Premier was threatening to ignore the deal with no rise in royalties. He said he'd increase royalties. Everyone dismissed it, or the Labor Party did. He's gone ahead and made good on his threat. Do you actually support that?
Well, I mean, firstly, you're quite right to describe this whole thing as a mining tax mess. It is, of course, a mining tax mess of the Treasurer's own making. Now, I mean, and of course, there is no deal as far as the state government in Western Australia is concerned. One of the incredibly incompetent things out of all of this, and something that the Treasurer is directly responsible for himself, is that the government decided to negotiate this deal exclusively and in secret with the three big mining companies, promising them to credit all state and territory royalties against the resources tax liability. But nobody in the federal government ever spoke to the state and territory governments about this. Now, as you would appreciate, resource taxation, royalty revenue is obviously very important to state and territory governments, and you can't reform resource taxation, so-called, without actively engaging state and territory governments. That was obviously too difficult for the Treasurer. He went for the lazy tax grab, and the consequences are now here for all to see.
Senator, without just stating the blindingly obvious of how badly Labor's handled this, let's just look at the reality of it, though. The decision by the West Australian Premier to increase the royalty tax, I mean, if all you people are going around saying it's terrible to increase taxes on miners, how can you support the state government increasing the royalties?
Well, I mean, firstly, there's a couple of points here. Under the Constitution, raising royalties on resources is entirely the authority of state and territory governments.
Yes,
and of course, I'll get to the point. The important point here is, firstly, there is a part that is a responsibility for states, and there's another part, the income taxing part, the company tax part, the tax on profits, which is a responsibility for federal governments. Now, what Colin Barnett has done is not so much increase royalties. He has actually removed a concession which applied to iron ore fines, so that the royalties that apply to iron ore fines are now the same as those that apply to iron ore lumps, and that is 7.5%. Now, the Federal Treasurer, Wayne Swan, has known for a long time that that was part of the state government's plan in Western Australia. He knew about this before the federal government, in fact, signed on the dotted lines that they would credit all state and territory royalties against the resources tax liability.
But can I just ask the simple question? In theory, okay, this one might be an anomaly that they've done, but then, as the party that doesn't think there should be increased taxes or imposts on mining companies, would you argue that perhaps the West Australian government shouldn't increase the royalties any further?
Well, I mean, our argument is that the appropriate return to the community from a non-renewable, the extraction of a non-renewable resource, is a matter for state governments. Now, the federal government has said to us that they wanted to reform resource taxation. They wanted to make the system simpler and fairer. But of course, what we've ended up with is a tax system that's going to be more complex and less fair. We've ended up with a multi...
Let's be honest, you people have to take some responsibility for that, because you opposed the original one. I mean, at the end of the day, you've been very successful in helping to make a hash of it, haven't you?
Well, but the original one was even worse. Well, it was at least as bad. This is pretty bad too. I mean, the problem is this. This is a bad tax which came out of a bad process. And of course the government should scrap this mining tax at the federal level, and they should start from scratch with a proper, open and transparent and inclusive tax reform process, focusing on making our tax system simpler, fairer and coming up with fewer taxes.
I couldn't agree with you more. And then would you support the original argument of the mining community, even if, and I know it's hard to criticise the West Australian Premier when you're from Perth, but would you agree that perhaps royalties should be replaced by a better mining tax?
Well, but the thing is, this is the important point. The mining industry at the time, and of course Ken Henry incidentally also recommended that state-based royalties on resources be replaced, and the operative word here is replaced, with a national profits-based resource rent tax. But that is of course not what Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan are proposing. They're proposing a top-up tax, not a replacement tax. And of course, like our position from the coalition's point of view, we think that the current arrangements are working very well. We think that quite appropriately state and territory governments should make judgments on what the appropriate rate of royalties is as the price that the mining companies have to pay for the value of the resource that they're taking out of the ground, and which belongs to the people of those respective states. And the federal government ought to collect the tax on profits, of course, through the company tax arrangements. Now, obviously arguments as to whether it's high enough, too high, not low enough. I mean, these are matters as far as royalties are concerned to be debated at the state level, and as far as company tax is concerned to be debated at the federal level.
Meanwhile, you and the Libs could just, and the Nats and the opposition could just sit back and watch with the smile on your face, I think, the way it's going. But can I ask you, well, last time we spoke, you were actually sceptical. You weren't sure that this legislation would ever get through. Are we any closer, despite the fact we've got a second budget that's projections are based on revenue from this, are we any closer to the legislation, given you were chair of the Senate committee looking at it, or do you still think there's a chance we might never see it?
Well, we haven't seen any legislation so far. I mean, we're told that the government intends to introduce the legislation in the near future. But, I mean, obviously, from our point of view, as I've mentioned, we think this is a bad tax which came out of a bad process. We were promised simplification of our tax system, and, of course, this makes it more complex, and it's just a multi-billion-dollar new tax targeted at one particular industry, a very important industry for Australia. So, from our point of view, we will continue to make the arguments to everyone else in the Parliament.
I understand you're against it and you'll make the arguments, but do you have any inkling, seeing as nobody else seems to, do you think we will see legislation? If so, when could we hope to see it? Before Christmas term of this Parliament? This century?
It's very hard to have any inkling in relation to anything that involves the Treasurer Wayne Swan. I mean, certainly we've been given indications in the past that there would be legislation. I've got absolutely no confidence that the Treasurer is able to manage this process competently in any way, shape or form whatsoever.
Now, just as we're running out of time, I'm not going to ask you if you oppose the carbon tax. That's a lay-down misere. Can I just ask, from your perspective from Western Australia, is the mining industry more anti the carbon tax or the mining tax, or are they able to be so ferally opposing everything on all fronts?
Well, we've got a federal Labor government that is addicted to spending, that has been wasteful, and that, of course, is always casting around for more money. And that is why we've got a government that comes up with one new ad hoc tax grab after the other. The Henry Review was supposed to deliver fewer taxes, because at present we've got 125 taxes across Australia.
No, I'll just ask you straight out, Senator. Yeah. Carbon tax, mining tax, from a Perth perspective, which is worse or both as bad?
They're both as bad, and of course they come one on top of the other, which is making it even worse.
Now, I had to get to this just to ask you, because I gather it's the question you have to ask every Liberal at the moment. Do you have a leadership baton in your pocket there?
I'm of course in the Senate, so I've got a great aspiration, great ambition to help the team maximise our chances of winning the next election on behalf of the people of Australia, because they deserve a better government.
Just because you're in the Senate doesn't stop you. There's a bloke in Brisbane who isn't even a politician, and he's running.
I think that Tony Abbott is doing an outstanding job. He will do an outstanding job as Prime Minister of Australia. The sooner the better, because Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan are making a real mess of it.
Now, Senator, can I just throw in one quick question? You were born in Austria, I gather.
No, I was born in Belgium.
Oh, it was Belgium. I'm sorry. Somebody called you, said some months ago that you were like Arnold Schwarzenegger. They thought your accent, but I won't bring any comparison. Good. I wanted to check where that accent was from. A lovely accent too, and doing a good job for the people of Perth, battling all those taxes that are going to upset the miners. I think we'll be speaking again about this, don't you?
I'll be back.
Thank you very much, Senator Matthias Cormann, Shadow Assistant Treasurer. And I'll be back in just a minute with our correspondent from Brisbane with all the good gossip from up north.